Hi everybody, Dana Shoaf, editor of Civil War Times, back with Melissa Wynn, director of photography, and Eric Mink from the National Park Service, and we're continuing to bring you some views of Fredericksburg, of course, the battle that took place in 1862 in December here in the city. I didn't want to not show you, of course, the river behind us, a very important river, important to this engagement, the Rappahannock River. One of the things that makes Fredericksburg fairly unique among Civil War battles is that it consists of contested river crossings, fights for bridgeheads, as well as heavy urban fighting that we mentioned earlier when Barksdale's headquarters was located on Princess Anne Street, coordinating the fighting. And we're standing at a plot of land that's owned by the National Park Service, in which there's a monument here to the 7th Michigan Infantry, I guess, or engineers. And Eric's going to tell us a little bit about what we couldn't quite remember. We think there's 6 bridges involved eventually with this engagement, correct?
Yeah, somewhere near there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure, and this is the upper bridge crossing.
Correct.
Yeah. Thank you. That person didn't want Melissa to get hit, so they beeped. But tell us a little bit about this monument here.
Yeah, there were in fact 3 crossing locations on the river, and this is what is known as the upper pontoon crossing. The middle pontoon crossing, just about a mile downstream at the southern end of the town, and then the lower crossing a few miles even farther downstream. But the monument here was placed here in 2003, and it's to the 7th Michigan Infantry. And the 7th Michigan was a regiment that was in Colonel Norman Hall's brigade of the Union 2nd Corps. And the 7th Michigan is noted for the fact that when the river crossing on December 11th was underway, as the engineers had extreme difficulty getting the bridges completed, exposed out here in the river. And as a result, the volunteers were asked for from the infantry, supporting infantry, with the idea of getting in the pontoon boats themselves and rowing across the river with the infantry, landing on the Fredericksburg side and establishing essentially a bridgehead, and getting the infantry up here, putting down fire so that the engineers could complete the bridges behind them. And the 7th Michigan was the regiment that volunteered to take on that operation. And so they did row across the river in the bridge, or in the boats. And once on this side, if you can see the topography of the ground right here, they were able to hug the bank here and then eventually push up, spill out into the streets, push the Confederates back, and the bridges were complete. And in the early 2000s, the park was approached by folks in Michigan about putting up a monument to the 7th Michigan for their efforts here. And this is the result. And in addition to the monument being erected to the 7th Michigan, the state of Michigan actually had in the State Museum a portion of a Confederate First National flag that had been liberated from Fredericksburg and taken back to Michigan during the war. And the state actually returned the flag, brought it back here, and donated it to the park. And it's currently on display in the Fredericksburg Battlefield Visitor Center. So the monument and returning the flag and the program here was rather large. But the 7th Michigan, again, taking on the dangerous mission of rowing across and establishing the bridgehead.
And it's interesting how they use the embankment here to get themselves organized before they moved into. And again, if you haven't read, it's vicious fighting in these streets. I mean, it's really something. And this little bas-relief shows you, you can see a pontoon bridge here. It's not completed, but when we say pontoons, we're actually referring to these wooden boats that they actually use some of the pontoon boats to row across. But these wooden boats were then anchored in the river. You can see them anchored here, and then the bridge decking is laid over those pontoon boats. And there were orders even given, you often read, when soldiers marched across, they were told not to march in step or the uniform vibration would damage the bridges, perhaps even break through the decking. So there were specialized engineer units that built these bridges with the assistance of infantrymen and other people. And of course, these engineer units were in charge of these large pontoon wagon trains to move all this stuff. And I wanted to read you an account. This is a really cool book, Bridge Building in Wartime, Colonel Wesley Brainerd's memoir of the 50th New York Volunteer Engineers. I'm going to read you a little bit, and then Eric's going to tell you what Brainerd saw here when they were trying to cross the river. And I should have pointed out that Chatham is visible on Stafford Heights across the river, and that's where Burnside watched the engagement, and Major General Sumner also were up there. That's where your office is located, right?
Correct.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to read you this account. Now let's work backward before the Battle of Fredericksburg to the end of October 1862, after the Battle of Antietam. At that time, Major General George McClellan is still in command of the Army of the Potomac, and eventually, after resting and refitting, he will move his Army of the Potomac back into Virginia. The 50th New York Engineers built a bridge at what was then called Berlin, but today is known as Brunswick. So if you're familiar with the Maryland campaign, you may know where Brunswick, Maryland is, right on the Potomac River. It's about 50 miles northwest of D.C. Now, Brainerd talks about, they built this bridge, the Army of the Potomac unit stationed there crossed over, and he said, I'm going to kind of move through his memoirs here, we saw the last wagon, the last straggler safely across and away, and then waited patiently for orders, which we daily expected. The campaign had commenced with a vigor which promised success. The weather was charming, neither cold or warm, clear, gentle, and bracing. The roads were in excellent condition, and everything seemed to favor a speedy and favorable termination of the war. Gradually, the rear of the army became so far separated from us that we could get no news from headquarters, and as the country between us was infested with bushwhackers, we were entirely cut off from news. Now, what's happening here is these engineers have built these bridges. McClellan's army has moved into Virginia, and they've kind of forgotten about these guys in Brunswick. They can't really leave because they have to stay in their armed bridgeheads because there's a lot of guerrilla activity. So they're sitting there wondering essentially what's going on. Now, to continue, moving through a little bit, day after day, Brainerd says, we waited for orders and wondered why they did not come. Gradually, we accumulated our material and put things in readiness for instant departure, feeling that our orders must come before long. Thus, the beautiful autumn days wore along, but no news from the army. We were completely isolated, perhaps even forgotten. This wonderful quiet proved to us to be the calm before the storm. Suddenly, we received vague rumors of the removal of McClellan from command. Then the news was confirmed, and we were informed that General Burnside was in command. Time passed on, still they're waiting, and we were full of anxiety when one day late in the afternoon came the order for us to move immediately to Washington with our entire bridge train. The order had been written 7 days before reaching us, and therein consists a secret which never before had been revealed of all our subsequent woes, misfortunes, and defeats. 7 days the order was written, and we were still at Berlin, 48 miles from Washington. Like men of steel, we sprang to work, and before the sun cast its shadow across the Potomac, our entire command was well underway and rapidly moving in the darkness in the direction of Washington. Now, that's one of those fog of war little anecdotes, right? That sort of presages the federal disaster here, because so the large story of Fredericksburg, and Eric, you can help me, is that Burnside takes command in November of the Army of the Potomac, and then he moves pretty quickly to this location, to Falmouth and across the Rappahannock here where you see Chatham. And he gets past the Confederate flank. There's no Confederates really here in Fredericksburg, but the Federals need bridges to cross the river. And you can see the administrative confusion. You've got a pontoon regiment, the 50th New York, is kind of forgotten in Brunswick. They don't know what's going on. And eventually they get orders that are 7 days old. We need you right away. And the slow arrival of the pontoons, for this reason and others, is going to delay Burnside's attempt to cross the river until the Confederates have successfully fortified those heights that we saw from the courthouse cupola, and ringed them with artillery and used the stone wall in Nary's Heights to, really provide a killing ground in the open plain before that high ground. And Eric, you had mentioned Brainerd also writes in here, this is a great book by the way, about being here at Fredericksburg and trying to get these bridges built, and if you want to relate that.
Sure, yeah. Brainerd's account of the crossing here at the Upper Pontoons crossing on December 11th, 1862 is just wonderful. Very clear, very descriptive. And so the engineers had to come down very early in the morning on December 11th under cover of darkness, a fog that had settled on the river, and begin construction. And one can imagine standing here and looking across the river. If men are on the other side of the river, hammering planks on and creating the bridge, you can't really do it secretly.
Can't do it quietly, no.
And so the Confederates up here knew what was going on. And as we mentioned at our last stop, William Barksdale's Mississippians were here in town.
Now, quickly before you go on, are there houses here, or is this open?
Well, the yellow house directly across the street here has an 1849 construction date. So, sitting where it is, it's pretty fascinating to think that given what would ultimately be unleashed on Fredericksburg and the artillery bombardment that would be directed at the pontoon crossing points by the Union artillery, that a building like that would survive.
Yes.
But from it being a wooden structure, undoubtedly it was heavily damaged, but shells passing through, not knocking it down.
I believe I read where some 5,000 Union artillery shells were fired into the town during the battle.
Yep, and a portion of the town, some buildings burned, others, like I said, just holes punched through them through solid shot and shells that didn't explode. But the Confederate infantry, Barksdale's men, took shelter wherever they could, basements, stairwells, inside the buildings. And so you can see just how close we are to the crossing point.
That's not very far at all.
Not at all. And so Brainerd, in his wonderful description, said that they got, I guess it was about, I think he indicates maybe close to halfway across the river. And he specifically says that they gazed across at the Confederate side where we're standing, and just then the fog shifted a little bit, and they could see the Fredericksburg side of the river. And Brainerd said that as the fog shifted, what he saw were arms going up and down. And what he was seeing were the Confederates loading their muskets.
Ramming their cartridges.
Right. And then suddenly the fog settled back in. And so, the way he describes it, you can just
it's just
chilling.
Absolutely chilling, yeah. If you're halfway across, look how close that is. And they can see these guys. I mean, that is not far.
No, not at all. But they didn't get it completed, and so they had to call on the Union artillery to, Burnside opened to unleash the artillery on the town in hopes of driving the Confederates back, if not, or at least hunkered down. And that went on for a few hours. And then finally, Norman Hall calls on the 7th Michigan, and they come across. But Brainerd's account is by far the best account of the engineers trying to cross at the upper pontoon.
And Eric, you said that quickly, but for several hours, the Federals bombard the town. It's not 20 minutes. They let it rip for a while.
I mean, to the extent that when the Federal infantry, the 7th Michigan, followed by the 19th, 20th Mass, the rest of Hall's brigade, as they got across and then pushed up into the streets, it was literally street to street and house to house fighting. There are accounts of from the Massachusetts soldiers, the 19th or 20th, I forget which regiment, literally describing as they're going in the back door of a house, the Confederates are running out the front door of the house.
Unbelievable.
Busting out onto the next street up, Caroline, and then Princess Anne, and just getting heavy fire as soon as they move into the intersection. And so ultimately, by the time the Federals have gotten into town, it's now dark. So this starts before the sun comes up,
and it takes
but the actual occupation of town doesn't occur until the sun has set. And so therefore Barksdale has done what he was ordered to do, which was delay. Because the need for delay was Stonewall Jackson was much farther downstream, and Lee is trying to concentrate his troops.
Just in a general sense, we're on the left flank of the Confederate Army, basically.
Yes. This is Longstreet and Jackson. Jackson is downstream, coming up to concentrate with Longstreet.
And Jackson is down on Prospect Hill, I believe. So we're on the left. We're sort of staying on the left side of the battlefield today, just to kind of put that in a perspective. But I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you know what the population of Fredericksburg was at the time?
Not off the top of my head.
But it had a sizable African American population as well, correct?
Yes.
And were those folks still in town, or had they evacuated?
Well, the Burnside had given the order. First of all, Burnside had requested that the town surrender. Which it did not. But time was given for the civilians to get out. Lee had, in fact, ordered, if not had encouraged, if not ordered the civilians, but there were still many civilians who remained in town. It's just like any, how people react to, natural disasters and such. They're not leaving their property. I mean, this is, folks were not willing, some were not willing. And so we do have a couple accounts of civilians who remained in town and for 3 to 5 days stayed in the basements and cellars of their houses.
And it's not a good look the Union Army puts on here.
The looting of the town takes place on December 12th, because the attacks against Maurice Heights don't occur until the 13th. So the Union Army spent an entire day in town, the looting occurs. And a lot of folks have looked at what happens or why this happens. Extreme frustration. The Union Army arrives and almost for an entire month are sitting on the heights watching Confederates move in because they got here first but just couldn't get across because of the lack of bridges. So is it taking out frustration on the town, having to fight through the town? But interestingly enough, I think we've kind of anecdotally looked at the fact that those civilians who stayed, their houses and their belongings, were somewhat respected. But the empty houses, it was fair game.
And you kind of see that replayed a little bit on Sherman's March to the Sea too, actually, where if they come upon a plantation and the folks are there, not so much.
The soldiers are confronted with.
They come upon an empty plantation, it's all bets are off, and they loot it, which is unfortunate, of course. So real great devastation visited to the town of Fredericksburg by artillery fire and the looting as well. And there's Confederate fire too into the town as well. The Confederates fire into the town once the Federals are in it. So
exactly. And the Confederates fire into the town just as we were talking at the courthouse. They're shooting at the courthouse. Any of the side streets that run up, such as this, run up towards Maurice Heights. They're firing down whenever they see Union troops visible.
So it's getting shot at from both sides.
Well,
cool stuff, really bloody fighting. Again, the fighting along the river is a little battle in itself. It's really, really something. And I think we're going to go over to Chatham.
We can head on over to Chatham.
And we're going to show you an artifact that's not on display, that Eric has been kind enough to get out, and we're going to take a look at some stuff over there.
Our curator, Louisa, has pulled the artifacts out, and she'll talk to us a little bit about the artifacts.
So we'll get to meet her as well. Anybody that wants to say hi, Melissa's standing in the street now.
Robert McIntosh.
Hey, Robert.
Joshua Walters. Wendy Whitson-Groguski.
Joshua and Wendy, thank you.
Mark Grimm is suggesting that we go to the Mason-Dixon Cafe for lunch.
Mark Grimm, my friend from Ohio. Okay. He's excited because the Cleveland Browns are doing well.
Eric Bruce, David Carr. Speaking of Carr.
Here comes a car. Okay. The street. We're not making Melissa get in a super highway, but there is some traffic. So I think we'll sign off for now. We're going to cross the Rappahannock with considerably less difficulty than Burnside's men had to undertake, and we will see you at the beautiful Chatham Manor in about 20 minutes or so again. So for Dana Shoaf and Melissa Wind, Civil War Times, Eric Mink, fabulous ranger for the National Park Service, we'll see you in about 20 minutes.